Howdy, it's Kyle comparing Maine and New Hampshire. These are two states that border each other in New England and have many things in common, but despite that have very different tax structures and financial situations. They share the same geography, population, politics, and demographics, yet have very different economies. And whenever we talk about two different places maybe having different tax structures or financial situations, the only reasons that can possibly be for the differences are going to be politics and demographics, right? So that's what it always has to be according to the way things are now. But what happens if I take away the low-hanging fruit and you have to analyze the situation without looking at politics or demographics? So that's what I want to do here. Take a look at two seemingly similar states, but then take a look at how these economies can be so different, even though the race and the politics are the same. I'm going to start off by talking about the similarities between the states. The populations are oddly quite similar. They're both just over 1.4 million people. That ranks them 42nd and 43rd in population, and they've been pretty similar populations for many decades now. For demographics, they're both very similar, mostly white people with a small number of various minority groups. And they're also pretty similar in terms of their politics. And these would both be considered moderate states, maybe slightly left-leaning moderate states. They have very similar presidential elections, as you can see here. And both of these states have a lot of independent voters. In fact, Maine is the #1 state in the country for people that vote for third-party candidates. But you can look at the governor elections as well. Pretty similar numbers here, maybe slightly right-leaning for governors in New Hampshire. And you have some pretty odd numbers with some of the third-party candidates getting a lot of votes in Maine. But no matter how you look at it, these are both pretty moderate states with very similar politics, kind of falling within that 55-45 range. So the things I'll talk about from now on are going to be the differences in the state, but it won't be because of the politics. And when we're talking about economics, the differences can be pretty stark. For New Hampshire, the household income is $97,000 per year, ranking at 4th in the country. For Maine, it's $74,000 per year, ranking at 29th. So essentially, household income in New Hampshire is 1/3 higher than it is in Maine. Another big difference would be the poverty rate. New Hampshire has by far the lowest poverty rate in the country at 7%. Maine's is also fairly low as well at 10%, making it the 15th lowest poverty rate. But look at just how much lower the poverty rate is in New Hampshire compared to all the rest of the ones that are clustered together. And I'm not sure if that is significant from a statistics standpoint, but it certainly looks like it is. And the third major difference in economics between the states are the taxes. New Hampshire has both zero state income tax and zero sales tax, whereas Maine has an income tax just below or just over 7%. I'll call it 7% for this video, but they also have a sales tax at 5.5%. That is pretty low compared to other states, but they have both a very high income tax and a sales tax. So where does New Hampshire get its tax revenue? It's from property taxes. It has the third highest property taxes in the country at over 2%. However, two things with that, it's only third in the country. Illinois and New Jersey have higher property taxes, and they have other taxes as well. And Maine itself has relatively high property taxes, the 17th highest in the country. And these are massive differences in taxes, with really high income tax, relatively high property tax, and still some sales tax in Maine, with zero income tax and zero sales tax in New Hampshire. Even with that high property tax, it's still a very low overall tax burden. Okay, so if it's not the politics leading to some of these big economic differences, what is it? So let's take a look at the geography of these two states. So there are two major obvious differences between the two states. One is that Maine is much larger than New Hampshire in area. It's over 3 times as large, and also Maine has a much larger coastline. However, I wouldn't focus too much on just how much larger Maine is. A good chunk of that is just open wilderness, so the 1.4 million people in both of these states are spread out over generally the same type of area. The fact that Maine has more area and more woods does play a part into the economic differences of these states, but playing a much larger role is that long coastline. These two states have similar population, but Maine has a disproportionate chunk in just the Portland area, and most of the rest of the population is in the inland areas, including Augusta, Auburn, Lewiston, and Bangor. That leaves very few people that live on that long Maine coast. So as a result, you have just a handful of small towns, cute little towns that are off on their own. And many of these have a name that starts with B, interestingly enough. You have Belfast, Bath, Boothbay, Bahaba, but these are just small towns off on their own, not part of a larger metro and not surrounded by other large towns. And how that plays into the economy is that small towns like that are really cute are the kind of places that I like to visit. So these places often have a tourist-based economy, and where you have that, you often have lower wages because when I go places, I want to pay as little as possible for hotels and restaurants. So the hotel and restaurant owners want to keep their overhead as low as possible, pay relatively low wages. And to go along with that, Maine has Acadia National Park, one of the most popular national parks in the country. New Hampshire doesn't have any national parks. So as a result, Maine has a much more tourist-based economy. In fact, one of its nicknames is Vacation Land. So there's been a long tradition of people going to the Maine coast for some of these cute little towns or going to the woods to have a cabin up in the mountains. And New Hampshire certainly has tourism. The tourism board will be like, yeah, come here, come to our nice little towns, come to our mountains too. But New Hampshire isn't anywhere near as dependent on tourism as Maine. And how else having a long coastline affects the Maine economy is that the seafood industry becomes a major part of it. And as it stands now, commercial fishing is not something that's gaining in size, growing in economy, it's actually shrinking. Another big part of the economy is the art and music scene, largely in Portland. And that's a great thing for tourists like me to like to go to Portland and visit and have a good time, but artists and musicians don't have a lot of money. But because Portland is a very desirable place to live, it costs a lot to live there and wages are relatively low. And where all that extra size, all that extra forest area in Maine comes into play is that it's been more reliant on the lumber and paper industry. And many of these paper mills have closed down through the years, and New Hampshire has had the same paper mills closed there as well, but with smaller area, less woods. Paper mills, kind of like tourism, it's a smaller part of the overall economy of the state. So Maine's economy is largely based on tourism and the arts and fun stuff that has low wages, and also paper, lumber, and seafood, kind of stuff that's going away. Okay then, well, what is New Hampshire's economy based on? How can it be so much stronger? For New Hampshire, it comes down to primarily two things. One is its proximity to Boston. A very disproportionate percentage of the overall New Hampshire population lives in that southeastern corner pretty close to Boston, many of it is suburbs. Towns like Nashua, Derry, and Londonderry, just across the state line from Massachusetts, do have historic cores, but they also have a lot of new suburban type development. And to go along with that, Interstate 93 from the state line is 8 lanes all the way up through Manchester. So this whole southeastern portion of the state has an 8-lane interstate because many people are traveling back and forth to Boston. Now, it is very important to note that people that live in New Hampshire but work in Massachusetts do pay Massachusetts state income tax, which is 5% flat. Now, I'm sure for individual people in New Hampshire that kind of sucks, but I think for the overall state of New Hampshire that is actually a good thing. There are about 7 million people in Massachusetts, so imagine if they didn't have that law, maybe 500,000 of those would move across the state line to New Hampshire. If I'm going to work in Boston, I might as well not pay 5% income tax. So say 500,000 people move to New Hampshire, that would increase the population by 1/3. That would change the whole way the state operates. More congestion, more roads, more bridges, more schools, more cops, more firefighters, more paramedics. And even for the people paying that 5%, it's still pretty good because that's a big part of what makes New Hampshire operate so well. So you go back to that household income chart for states, look at Massachusetts, it's number 1 at $100,000 per year. So you have all of those high-wage jobs in the Boston metro area, many of them in high-tech kind of stuff, and many of those folks, again, live in New Hampshire. So they're taking those Massachusetts wages to New Hampshire, and that brings up the overall household income of the state. And the numbers don't lie. New Hampshire's household income is much higher than both Maine and Vermont. Being right there next to Boston is a huge asset for New Hampshire. But that's not the only thing that I think helps the New Hampshire economy operate so well. It's also because of the major high-tech and STEM sector. STEM being science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and it starts with having an Ivy League school in your state, Dartmouth College. It has about 7,000 students there, and according to its own website, a budget of about $1.5 billion. And this is a major research institution, elite medical school, elite biochemistry, all kinds of high-tech medical type things. And as a result, you have a lot of high-tech medical type things that are private sector but are associated with Dartmouth just having it right there. And another big part of the New Hampshire STEM economy is the DECA Company. It's a company started by Dean Kamen, a guy that's invented all kinds of stuff, including a lot of medical mobility aids. And the company he owns in New Hampshire basically just invents things. It's a company that comes up with new medical advancements, technological breakthroughs, new mobility aids. The people that work there are going to be some of the smartest people you're going to meet and making pretty good money. And this place employs over 1,000 people. This isn't some tiny little company. It's a big company. Per capita, that's a big player for a small state like New Hampshire and something that Maine doesn't have. So New Hampshire has high-wage jobs because of proximity to Boston and also some of the STEM stuff because of Ivy League and Cayman Industries. Whereas going back to Maine, it's largely tourism, seafood, lumber, and paper. Maine is home to the LL Bean Corporation, which is a huge $1.7 billion revenue company. And that is great, but that doesn't bring in the same type of highly skilled, high-wage type people that Dartmouth or Cayman Industries might. So you can see why you have such massive differences in household income. Again, $97,000 for New Hampshire, only $74,000 for Maine. And New Hampshire does have tourism, paper, lumber, and seafood, but not as much reliance on it as Maine. Okay, what about the poverty rate? It's so much lower in New Hampshire, even compared to some of the other high-wage states like Massachusetts and Maryland. This is just my hypothesis, but I do think this is where that 0% sales tax comes into play. Sales tax definitely has a negative effect on the economy in terms of disproportionately affecting poor people. So look at this map here of the states with the highest sales tax in the country. Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Oklahoma are amongst the poorest states in the country. And Mississippi is actually higher sales tax than you think. It seems like it's low, but they put sales tax on everything, including groceries, and Mississippi is a very poor state. Washington is the one state that has the high sales tax but not really high poverty rates. That's the one outlier. But then you look at the states with 0% sales tax, and none of them are really poor. New Hampshire has the lowest poverty rate in the country, Delaware 15th lowest, Montana is 25th, and Oregon is 31st, so that is above average poverty rate. And that Washington-Oregon dichotomy is very strange. If I cover this topic again, it'll definitely be those two states. Now, this is a fairly small sample size, but with most of the states having above 9% sales tax having high poverty rates, and the states with 0% sales tax having average or well below poverty rates, then that says something. But where this also plays in is that with New Hampshire, again, you have high wages and low poverty. That means higher home ownership rates. And for a state that depends on property taxes as its main tax revenue, that's a big deal. So a state like New Hampshire can function well by propping the people up at the bottom to having enough money to actually own a home. And the state can operate more efficiently because it's a single tax system. There's only one tax board for the whole state doing just property taxes. And that leads New Hampshire to having the tax structure that's closest to what's called Georgism. Georgism is an economic ideology I'll often hear people talk about, but it's based on a single tax system, the land value tax. Now, I'm certainly no economist, so I'm not going to get into the economics of it, but a property tax is not the same thing as a land value tax, which is the same general concept where it's just a single tax system based on property and land. So it's not true Georgism, but it is the state that operates closest to it, and it is the state that has the most efficient operating tax system in the country. And it's worth pointing out that New Hampshire has a major issue with opioids and fentanyl, especially in the northern part of the state. I can only imagine what the poverty rate would be in New Hampshire without this major opioid epidemic. It might only be 6%. But despite everything that I'm saying with New Hampshire having the better economy, the more wealth, the less poverty, if you were to ask me where would I rather live, it would be Maine. But I think that goes into part of the problem. I would rather live there. It's a more fun type place to visit. And again, that keeps kind of the wages low, but the housing costs high. So maybe the true secret to New Hampshire is just not being cool. But it's definitely not the demographics or the politics that makes the economies and financial situation of Maine and New Hampshire quite different. So that was my comparison between Maine and New Hampshire, and I like doing stuff like this where I take a subject where it's presumed to be political and break it down with geography and just nerdy stuff and show that it isn't because of politics. So if you like stuff like that, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve of this video, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography and nerdy stuff from a nerd like me. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King signing out. I want to give a special thanks to my Superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in becoming a Superior patron or perhaps an Erie or Huron patron, check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. As always, thank you very much.